So next I want to talk about the start tables and warming up the car. Ideally when you start the car and it's a cold start, you want it to idle a little bit richer, and as it warms up you want it to get to your 14:7 air-fuel ratio. If you recall from the first startup video I did, it took about 3 tries to start the car, which is pretty good. It means that the numbers that AEM delivered are in the right ballpark. So my car probably doesn't need a whole lot of attention here, but it is running a little bit rich as it warms up, so I'm going to want to clean that up, and as I do it I'm going to go over all the startup tables and explain how everything works. If your car starts and seems to warm up in a good air-fuel ratio and isn't running as rich as mine, then you can probably proceed to tuning the actual fuel table and moving on, and then at the end circle back to all of the startup tables just to fine-tune them. And before you really mess with the startup tables, you want your fuel map to be kind of correct, at least for this general area. And I know when we're dealing with idle, we're probably around this range. And if there are any cells below it or any cells in this RPM range that we're not normally going to hit when they're in idle, you want to correct those so that they're kind of matching the adjacent cells. So if these were all here and it was kind of dipped down low, and it wasn't a real big deal when you're messing with your idle because it was hovering over here on the right above 800 RPMs, around 1000 RPMs. It wasn't really using these cells, but when it comes time to talking about starting the car, it's going to have to transition through some of these cells, so you don't want it to have to dip down and then dip back up. So what I like to do is just make sure that they're kind of equivalent to the cells where you idle in. You don't want to have giant dips or anything there. And the same goes for this low vacuum region, and you can see I've kind of done that for the entire bottom. Maybe right here over, I should add a little bit more. We're obviously not going to be hitting these cells when we start the car, but it's a good idea to have them kind of mimic where you do end up idling. So right here, I'd probably change this lower section to be around 2.25 or 2.3. So you want to have this kind of in place, and if you're like me and it doesn't if it doesn't want to warm up correctly, now would be the time to kind of mess with it a little bit. But if it does warm up safely, it's not running around like a 10 air-fuel ratio, then you could skip and circle back to this later, because you need this fuel map, at least in this area, to be mostly correct when you're trying to dial in the start tables. So now we're going to go over the starting tables, and I know I've touched on these a little bit in the past, but we're going to go over them in a lot more detail now. So let me get the ECU connected. Alright, so the very first table involved is this one, and when AEM sees that the crankshaft is spinning more than 50 RPM, it's going to know that someone's trying to start the car, and it's going to jump right to this table. And this is temperature dependent, so it's 68 degrees in my garage. So what this is going to do is it's going to fire 14.3 milliseconds worth of fuel to all 6 injectors at once. So all 6 injectors will fire at the exact same time. This is the initial crank pulse, and then we're done with this table. It's got to move over to this crank injector timetable. And then this table is kind of a starting point. And you can think of this kind of like a fuel cell. So if we went back to the fuel cell table, if I was at 800 RPMs at this load, it would read 2.6, right? But when we're cranking the car, it's going to be below 400 RPMs. There's no cells for below 400 RPMs, so it needs to know what value to use. And that's what this table is for. So the starting point is got to be what you have it here, as, and it's throttle dependent. So between 0 and 70%, I'm going to start with an initial fuel cell value of 2.5 milliseconds. And then above 70% throttle, you can see we'll start with one of at 0%. And this is so if you think the car was flooding or too much fuel is going, you could mash the pedal and kind of lean it out and hopefully get the car started. But we don't want to have to do that every time we start the car. This is kind of a built-in feature that you can just know is there and use it if it comes down to it. And after this initial injector time of 2.5 milliseconds, that's what it's got to start off with. There's going to be a bunch of different fuel trims added to it. One of it is this warm-up enrichment, but there are a bunch of other ones as well. There's based on throttle, boost, gear, air temp. There's your warm-up enrichment again. There's a user fuel trim, a barometric pressure fuel trim, and there's even a few that aren't listed here. And we've already set the boost fuel trim. We made that nice linear line in one of the earlier videos. And AEM is going to talk about them down here. It'll give you a little explanation. And I find that this is a little bit incomplete because it doesn't mention everything. And I think some of the things that it mentions are a little bit out of order. And that's why I'm doing this video. And my hope is that once I go over all these, we'll do a little bit of data logging and I'll show you a log of me starting the car, and that'll really help tie things together for you. So back to the starting tables. We've got that 2.5 milliseconds initial pulse, and we're applying a bunch of fuel trims to it. And this is one of them. It's warm-up enrichment. So again, 68 degrees in my garage. So if I click this, it's going to add 34.2% extra fuel because of the temperature. So it's going to take this 2.5 milliseconds and it's going to apply this 34.2% multiplication to it, come up with a little extra fuel, and then tack that on top of the 2.5 milliseconds. And that's your warm-up enrichment. And you can see if we were doing a hot start, if we drove the car around, we came home, we shut it off, we ran into the house and then came back out, started it, it's still warm. We're not going to apply any extra fuel here. And then the last set of tables on this tab is a start extra decay and start extra versus temp. And these are going to work together. And it took me a little bit to wrap my head around this. Looking at the logs really helped. This start extra versus temp is easy to confuse with the warm-up enrichment. We've got a percentage over here on the left, and at the bottom we've got coolant temp. They kind of look like the same thing with different names. But what this is also temperature, but this temperature is going to count down. So right now it's 68 degrees in my garage. So if I tried to start the car right now, it's going to apply 27.3% extra fuel for 25 seconds. So we can see here that it's at the 25-second mark, and it's gotta count down. So the initial percentage will be 27.3, and then once we lose a second, that percentage is gonna drop. It may be like 26.1, and then after 2 seconds, it may be 25. It's gotta count down to 0. So this is just extra fuel that is applied for a specific duration after starting the car, and then it'll count down to 0. And we can see if the temperature is warmer, we're not going to apply that extra fuel for as long. So it won't be applied for as long, and we'll also start at kind of a lower percentage. And that's how it really differs. And the logs will help show this. So before we go over data logging, let's just talk about a few of the channels that we're going to be looking at for when I start the car. And I've added 2 over here, fuel trim coolant and fuel trim warm up. And these are essentially modifying the same thing, and I just added them both to kind of show you the differences. So the one that's got the parentheses, that's a pulse width value after this fuel trim has been applied. And fuel trim coolant is the percentage of extra fuel that was added. So there's a little bit of a difference. So after it calculates the the warm-up enrichment, it's got to know to add X amount of fuel by doing that percentage calculation, and that may turn out to be like 0.8 milliseconds or 1.4 milliseconds more. If you were monitoring this, you'd get the percentage difference, and if you were monitoring this, you'd get the milliseconds difference. And it wouldn't be that 0.8 or 1.2 milliseconds was added on top of that initial injector pulse, which was 2.5 seconds. You'd get the total value. So you'd be the 2.5 milliseconds value plus the milliseconds for the enrichment, plus you'd also see taken into account any other trims that happened before it. And you can see that over here, it says this is the fourth step in the calculation. So the value that you see after the warm-up enrichment is done, if it's 4 milliseconds, 2.5 milliseconds would come from this initial time. And then the other 1.5 milliseconds could have came from the warm-up enrichment, or it could have came from something in the second or third step. In AEM, they have some information over on the trims table that talks about that, and I said they don't give you the entire list, and I've gone through and kind of pulled everything out and made some sense of it. And the thing that kind of bugs me about AEM is they're not very consistent. So for warm-up temperature, you saw we could have it both ways. Some items you can only see the percentage values, kind of like individual fuel cylinder fuel trim or the Cecel fuel, whereas other values you can only see the pulse width after all the calculations are done. So I wish they had everything for both ways instead of some stuff for each way, and there's a few odd items like this that show it both ways. But we're going to circle back to this notepad thing after I start the car. I just wanted to kind of point that out, what we're going to be looking for. And then the other thing that I added here is this injector number 1. And you'll see over here it says, be aware that the screen update is much slower than the possible speed of this channel. So what injector number 1 does is it's got to show on if the injector is firing, or it's got to show off if the injector is not firing. And this, you can imagine, is going to be flipping on, off, on, off, on, off many, many times. And there's two types of data logging that I want to talk about. The first one is I could go up here and I could go to start PC logging. And right now it's doing a data log of what you see on the screen. The car's not running, the ignition is just on. And it's recording every single channel in this list and only those channels. If I were to try to data log this, it'd be very hit or miss in the log file. It wouldn't be a bunch of little ticks every time it fired. I'd see some of them wouldn't show. So doing this conventional logging isn't ideal for what I want to show you here. I'm just going to stop and save this data log file, and I'm going to save it right to my logs folder, and you can see I've got another one in there from before, and you'll see that the file name has PC in it, meaning it came from a computer or laptop in my case. And this kind of logging is probably fine and what you'd want to use if you're doing tuning on the streets, maybe trying to dial in your fuel. You can have the laptop in the passenger seat. That's what I do. All of the resolution as far as green or lit, rich, or the O2 feedback, that's all fine to capture with a laptop. It's only when you want to capture the stuff that happens many, many times a second that you may want to use the other type of logging. And that is internal logging. And if I go up to logging and do ECU internal logging setup, AEM delivers this logging that allows you to capture stuff a lot faster than if you had a PC setup. And they have 7 items that can be extremely fast, and then they have 37 items that are slower. And all of these are going to be faster than what your laptop could capture. And you can vary the logging rate. And if you do vary the logging rate, you can see if you don't log as fast, you get more runtime out of it. But I'm going to want to run as fast as I can when I'm doing the startup. And there's a bunch of different options that you can have. You can have logging always off, always on. You can have it on when the vehicle starts moving or when the engine is running. You can even do custom conditions. And before I start the logging and do a start of the car, I want to change these values because not all of these are fuel related, and to show you what I want to show, they don't come delivered like that from the factory. So you can click these and change them, obviously, but before I do any of that, I'm just going to save what they gave me, and it wants to save it into this program files directory, and I'm going to put this right in my Supra tuning folder just so I have it. And I could create a new folder called logging files or logging setup, but I'm going to use my workspaces folder. This has my my workspace that I have, and it's not going to have a lot of other things, so I'm just going to repurpose it for this as well. So delivered internal log setup, and I'm going to save that. And then you probably saw in that same folder, so I'm going to click load setup, and it points me again right to the program files directory. But if I go back to my workspaces folder, you probably saw that I had this fuel logging for startup. And that's right here, and I already configured all of this earlier on because the last thing you'd want to see is me struggle to get this list filled out. And this is what I want to capture. So I've got this built in, I've got it set to the fastest rate, and now I'm going to close. And it's going to say I need to reset the log to power cycle EMS, and then click OK after it's done. And you can see the ECU disconnected. I turned it back on, it connected, and I'm going to click OK. So now the car is logging everything right now because it's set to always on, and I'm just going to start the car. So it's running right now. I can see on my wideband, it's a lot richer than I want it. So I could make adjustments, but I'm gonna shut the car off right now. And I'm gonna turn the key back on, and I'm gonna go up to logging, and I'm gonna click download ECU log. And what do I want to do with the ECU log after I download it? I'm just gonna tell it to clear. So this is downloading, and I'm going to save the log to the same directory, and notice it has ECU in the name. So this will tell me that it came from the ECU, and I'm going to click save. So now let's take a look at that log file that we just captured, and that's going to be in my Supra tuning folder, and it's going to be in my logs. And I know it's this one because it says ECU, and I'm going to open up this, which is going to launch AEM data. And if it's your first time opening this, it can look a little strange. But basically on the right are all the channels that it logged. So these are the ones that I had set up in the internal logger. And then in the middle here are lanes. And all you really need to do is, if you want to see something, is just drag it to a lane. So I'm going to look at engine load, engine speed, and let's do, there should be air fuel in here. It's probably as O2, yeah, O2 number 1. And I'm going to drag some other stuff that I want to show you. I'm going to drag it to this bottom lane. And the nice thing about this is once you kind of set it up and you drag stuff where you want, it's going to remember it. So the next time that you open it, everything's going to be there. And I don't need all of these lanes. Let's remove one of them. Originally, I like to use one giant lane, but I've became appreciative of having multiple ones. And then in the middle, I'm going to add a few other things, and I'm going to explain what all these are after. So I want those start extra. Let's add this one. And yeah, let's add this one. So when you open the log file, we just added all the channels to it, but it's got to keep it scrolled all the way to the right, and I want to scroll back to when we actually started the car. I know on the bottom those are injectors opening, so I want to find where those kind of start, and I think I'm getting close. Yeah. So right here is the first time an injector was fired. You can see all the injectors are 0 right here. This is the first time one was fired, and if you look, they're actually all fired. They all have a status of 1. And this is that initial fuel pulse that I talked about. And if we look back at AEM, I said it was 68 degrees in the garage. 14.3 milliseconds should be all of these pulses. And in here, I've actually got that as 14.33 milliseconds. AEM is just showing us 1 decimal. You can configure it to show 2 if you want, but I think 1 is good enough. So that's when all the injectors fired, and then the very first injector for the sequential ignition was injector 4, and then we have 1, and then we have 5, and we can see up here. Here's kind of the RPM as the car is started, and I know I said that the crank start RPM was 50, and it certainly doesn't look like it's going 50 RPM here. It's zeroed out, and we've got kind of this sequence of events happening, and I'm not sure what this discrepancy is. I chop it up to it's probably just a delay with the logger. All of this stuff is happening in a very short amount of time, and we're asking it to do logging on top of it. So if stuff doesn't line up perfectly how you would expect, that's not too much of a concern when we're dealing with this level of resolution and telling stuff to try to log as fast as possible and to really capture all of these trigger events. So let's look at one of these injectors, and I'm going to do this is injector number 1, and I want to show kind of how the fuel trims work. And if I look up here, we've got this fuel map, and I've already kind of gone through this, and I put this together to make it a little bit easier to understand. So we had our initial fuel pulse, and that was our 14.33 milliseconds. If the value was larger, like if we had over 52 milliseconds, you would have actually seen a second pulse for the remainder of what the first one didn't fire, but we don't have that at 14.3. And this is where we are right now. This is where we read the fuel map value, and I've got 2.52, and that should look and sound familiar. That's not coming from the fuel table, that's coming from this crank injector time. And here's our 2.52 milliseconds. And if we go back to this, that's our starting value, and then we're going to start applying all of these fuel trims. So the first one that's applied, and you can get this order kind of by looking at the help menus in AEM. You can find a little bit online. It doesn't cover everything, but I was able to piece it together by a combination of both of those, and then just looking at the logs really helped. So the first one is TPS and AIT, and this is what I was talking about. The initial pulse is 2.52, and here's our TPS, and TPS is also showing 2.52. That doesn't mean that it added that on top of it. It's just showing us what the pulse width is after adding the TPS correction, after adding the air intake temperature correction. And back in AEM on the trims tab, I've got a lot of these zeroed out. Here's the TPS, here's the AI air temp, also the baro, the gear, the user. I'm not showing nitrous here, but I know that's zeroed out as well. So those aren't really doing anything. The pulse width is still going to be the same after that. But then we get to warm up. And if I look at fuel trim warm up over here on the right, it's 3.38 milliseconds after going through and calculating that fuel trim. So I know if I take this 3.38 and I subtract the 2.52 that it had coming in, that gives me a difference of 0.86 milliseconds. So this trim added that on top of the initial pulse width. And we can ignore this right now. I'll circle back to this when I'm done. And then the fuel trim boost is the next kind of fuel trim in the equation, and that's at 3.33. So that actually caused it to decrease by 0.05 milliseconds. Then we go to the baro. That did nothing. That was zeroed out in the fuel trim table, so our pulse width is still 3.33 milliseconds. Then we go to the start fuel trim. And the start fuel trim, it went from 3.33 to 4.2, and that's a difference of 0.87 milliseconds. And that fuel trim comes back to the start tab, and it's down here based on the temperature, so it was a certain percentage of fuel being added to it, and that trim is what caused the pulse width to increase. So then we have our alt, our nitrous, our gear, our user. Those are all zeroed out, so the pulse width stays the same. And then we get to this cell fuel. And this is what I was talking about, where not all of the trims have an option that have parentheses. So there's not an option in there to give me the pulse width after a cell has taken into account. All I can really look at is this fuel trim cell, which is a percentage value of extra fuel that it added. So it added 0%. So I'm still at my 4.2. There is individual cylinder trim. I've got that zeroed out, and that's not available when you're just looking at the standard tabs. It's one of these hidden tabs. If I go to cylinder trims, you can have an injector have a higher percentage than the other. This is advanced stuff. Just leave all this zero. Don't even bother going into the tab unless you just want to make sure that that everything is zero. So let's go back to where we are. So after all of those fuel trim calculations, we're left with the ending pulse width value of 4.2. And we can see that over here. This is our ending value of 4.2. And then we're going to do the battery offset. And the battery offset is going to add a little bit of time on to give us that injector pulse. And the injector pulse here, I'm looking at injector number 1 is 5.1. So that means there's around a millisecond of injector pulse. And if you go back to one of my earlier videos, for the battery offset for a car with the alternator running, it was 0.8. But if you remember here, the car is cranking. It's not running, so the battery voltage is going to be a little bit less, and we can see it here, 11.48 volts. So that moves it back in the table. So we call for a little bit longer pulse width than normal. And this is what we end up with for our final pulse. So I said I would circle back to this stuff. And these are calculations that I did based off of the other trims that you can modify that aren't the pulse width version. They're actually a percentage. So if we look at what we have here, we're in the warm-up stage, and that's this fuel trim coolant. So at this point in the map, it's 34.18% extra is being added because of the coolant temperature. So we can take that 34.18%,
0.3418, and we can multiply it by the current pulse width. And that's going to give us 0.86, and that's the same value in milliseconds that's being added on. So there are different ways to kind of look at it. But what I want to point out is right here. If we look at the other thing that kind of changed the fuel quite a bit, that was the start. And that's the start extra value right here, and it's 26.4%. So if we do the same kind of calculation, and I want to show you what happens here. If we apply this to the original pulse of 2.520, we're going to get 0.66, and that's not what was added on here. What was added on here is that percentage applied to the pulse width going into the seventh position in the trim cycle. So 0.264 times 3.33 gives us 0.879, which is this value. So don't think of it as the fuel trim percentages modify the current pulse. They modify what comes into them. So what does that mean? That means if we were to make changes to the warm-up table, if we were to make changes to this table right here, it would lower the fuel value here, but it would also lower this calculation as well, because this calculation is applied to what's here. So it'll have kind of twice the effect. It'll kind of skew it a little bit downstream. And I'm sure all of these other trims as well. I mean, I haven't tested them, but I'm sure if this works that way, that any of the other trims work that way, where calculations further downstream are gonna not go off of the initial value, but go off of the value that they are when that trim is taken into effect. So let's jump back to the actual map and see if there's other stuff that we can point out. I want to look at this right here. This is the fuel map value, which is the starting cell that we kind of base our trim calculations off of, and that's coming from this crank injector time, like I pointed out. But we can see right here, after the car, the RPMs are increasing. It just started. It switches over to the actual fuel value from the fuel table. And we can see that it doesn't just flip right to that value. It looks like it kind of goes up and then it goes down. And the reason for this kind of corresponds to the load. And the load is up here. It's this white line. And when the car is just sitting there and you haven't started it yet, there's no vacuum or anything on that manifold. So as soon as you go to start it, there's a split instance where that the motor's going to start. It's going to start pulling vacuum in the manifold, and the load is going to decrease. So what you're really witnessing here is back at this fuel table, we're somewhere around kind of this area, and then when the car starts and we start pulling more vacuum, we get down to here. So we can see these cells. It could be like 2.4, 2.6, 2.5, and it should settle out somewhere between 2.3 and 2.2. And we can go back here, and right here we're at 2.6, and as it moves down the map, we kind of get closer to our 2.2. So what does this mean? One thing that we should try to achieve, or a recommendation, is we don't want a huge drastic change here. Obviously, the fuel map needs to be the fuel map. Whatever it looks like, that's based on driving and idling conditions. We don't want to change that. But what it means is this injector crank time, kind of the starting value. I would put this in the ballpark of where it's going to go to the fuel map, and that's kind of how it's set up, which is pretty good right now. I don't know if that's by luck or coincidence, but this is going to vary between 2.6 and 2.2. So what's in the middle of that? 2.4, 2.5. So this is kind of in the ballpark already. You wouldn't want to have this real high or real low because then you're going to have a bigger jump right here. And then the next thing that we can point out here is this start extra and start extra end. So this up here, this kind of orangish line is the start extra end, and see how it's at 100. And we just started the car. This is right where it flipped over to reading from the fuel table. And as we go on, we can see the start extra end starts to count down. And start extra is the amount of fuel kind of being applied there. So if we cycle through this, we can see it steps down. And as it steps down, we're going to start seeing that start extra fuel also drop. Let me go a little bit further. Oops. So we're at 26.4, and now it's at 25.4. And I didn't leave the car running long enough to make it count all the way down to 0. But it will count down to 0 if you start it and let it idle until it warms up. So that's a good way to determine what the difference is between the warm up and the start extra. We can prove that right in the logs if you're a little bit unclear of what the definition and kind of help menu said about it in AEM Tuner. The logs kind of prove what that is. And then let's look at kind of the top lane that I have. Let me get back to where the car started. So this is where it transitioned. This is where the RPM started picking up as the car was starting. And we can see that I've got an O2 value here. And normally if you start a car, you probably look at your wideband and you know it's going to maybe flash or read 17.9 or 8.5. It's going to be locked on something. It may have like 2 little dashes. And the wideband's got to warm up before it starts reading. And in my case, I was doing the video. I had the key on. I was explaining stuff. So the car wasn't started, but the key was on. So because the key was on, it was heating that sensor, and there really wasn't a delay when I turned the key a little bit more to start the car. So if you're trying to get a look at what your air fuel ratio is when you're starting the car like that, turn the key on, let the sensor heat up for a few minutes, and then start the car, and you'll get this reading. And you should also do it the other way as well. If you come into a cold start, get in the car, get your laptop set up where it'll log, and just turn the key. And then you'll be able to look at this, and what you'll see is kind of a straight line at some air fuel ratio, and then somewhere down the line, you're going to see that it starts reading. And you can use these timestamps at the top to figure out how long that was. And the reason this is important, I'm going to go over to this O2 feedback, is this O2 feedback versus temp. So right now it was 68 degrees. This means don't do any O2 feedback for at least 13 seconds if it's 68 degrees. And you want to make sure that this table can compensate for that time. So if at 68 degrees, if I just started my car right out of nowhere and my wideband flashed the 2 dashes or whatever, it didn't start doing an accurate reading and it took 30 seconds to warm up, I wouldn't want to leave this table like this because it could be reading whatever the default value is. Maybe it's 8.5, maybe it's 17.9. And if there's any kind of O2 feedback happening off that value, it could be bad. So you want to make sure that this window kind of covers all your ranges. So we just we'll want to test it at 68, and then you also want to test it for hot starts. And in this circumstance, it doesn't really matter for anything below 122 because that's a requirement for when my O2 feedback happens. but anything above it, if you do a hot start and it looks like it's only got a 5-second delay, if it takes that wideband like 8 seconds to respond, you could have 3 seconds where your O2 feedback's trying to go off of an incorrect value just because your sensor isn't warmed up fully yet. And I do have my O2 feedback off right now. That's what I did for the startup. I didn't want to have that interfering with any of the values that I was showing. So let's talk about adjustments now. So I know the car runs a little bit rich, and let's see what I can do about that. I'm gonna again kind of go back to where the car started, and this is my air-fuel ratio. It's lean obviously because the car's not running, and then as it starts, fuel's being added, and it richens up to 10.4, and gradually over time, you can see it gets even a little bit richer. But over time, it is going to start going back up a little bit. And I think that's too big of a dip. I don't like that it's going that rich. I want to make it a little bit leaner for my air-fuel ratio. So I'm at 68 degrees, and I can do that 2 different ways. And you saw from what I showed you in the fuel trim notes that the things that were really affecting this is the start fuel and the warm-up temperature. So you could technically pull it from either. I'm going to pull a little bit probably from the start fuel and see what kind of results that gets me. So I know the temperature, I know what I want to pull it from, and you don't have to go through all these calculations every time either. If you know that, hey, I've got this trim off, this trim off, this trim off, this trim off, the barrel trim off, you'll know exactly what to look for. And honestly, that's probably why they've got these other start extra and fuel trim coolant things in both ways, because those are the most common ones you're going to look at. So they want to give you the pulse width version of it, and they want to give you the percentage version of it. So let's go back to AEM Tuner, and I'm going to go to my start tabs. And what I want to do is mess with the start fuel around 68 degrees. So this is the decay rate, so it's going to count down from 25 seconds. And then this is the fuel rate. So we're adding 27% here. So I want to drop this down, and I'm not going to, I mean, I can subtract this cell, but I know it's going to be some kind of linear action. So I'm just going to start from the back, and I want to do what I can to drop this down. So it's at 27%. Let's try to get it down to like the 15 area. So I'm going to do a little bit of subtraction here and just see what that gets me if I interpolate. So we're at 18. So let's go a little bit more. And the reason I'm making kind of a big adjustment here is you don't get a lot of attempts to do this. The more you mess with it, the warmer the car gets, and then you have to wait. So I'm just trying to make it a little bit better for what it is now. So that's at 16. It's almost 10%. So let's try that. Let me get this calibration file uploaded, and I'm gonna try to do it fairly quick to see if I can get it so where it starts where the O2 sensor isn't already warmed up. So put the key in, it's on, and this is what it's reading. We've got our change here. I'm going to go up to logging, and for this I'm just going to reset the log because we only get 3.5 minutes, and it could be pretty full from the last time. And once it stops recording, it stops recording until you clear it, unless we had it looping, which I don't. So I'm going to reset this log. Okay, it wants me in a power cycle the car, so I got it turned off, and I've turned it on. Click OK, close this, and it's ready to start. And I can see my wideband gauge is 8.5 right now on my BTI gauge is showing it. So let's see what this does for me. Now it shows around 10.4, so it's still a little bit rich. Let me stop the car. And I gotta keep the key on if I want to download this log. So I'm gonna download the internal log. I'll just tell it to keep for now because I'm gonna clear it for the next test. And we'll save that to this file. I'm gonna turn my key off so that it's not heating the sensor anymore. Maybe that'll give it some time to cool. And I'm gonna go to my logs folder. And this is the latest one. And if I open this, you can see it saved everything else that I had before. So I don't have to drag anything around. And let's see what we're working with. So this is where the car started and the RPMs increased. And you can see my wideband's 8.5 here. So my wideband isn't heated up. And let's just look at the time when this starts. So 13:02. And let's look for when the wideband changes. Still at 8.5. Right here is where the wideband starts reading. So it was 13:02, so about 7 seconds. In AEM on my O2 feedback for 68 degrees, I've got 13 seconds. So it's about halfway there. And honestly, probably AEM configures this table when you select their sensor, or let's hope they do. But it doesn't hurt to double check to make sure that you've given it enough time to warm up. So I really don't know what the air-fuel ratio was before this because my sensor wasn't warmed up. So any more tests that I do, I'm going to leave the key on for a little bit to hopefully get the wideband a little to get it ready, so I can look in there. But I can see that after it warmed up, it's 10.4. So I think I need to pull a little bit more fuel out, and that's what I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna go back to AEM Tuner, and I'm gonna go to the Start tab, and I pulled out fuel here, and this is starting to get down pretty good. This is at 15%. So I'm gonna cut a little bit from this table as well. This is the other one that can adjust it. Really, it's these two tables, and this is at 34%. So let's drop this down, and we'll interpolate again. So it went from 34% to 21%. So that's a pretty big jump. Let me turn my key on. I'm going to save this cow file, and I'll leave my key on for a little bit so that the sensor heats up. And the thing about starting the car is we're messing with it right now, and it's 68 degrees out, 70 degrees. The more I mess with this, the warmer the car's got to get. Even if I only let it run for 10-15 seconds at a time, it is going to warm up. So this is one of those things that you'll have to monkey with throughout the week, especially if you have big temperature swings. I live in Vermont, so it can be 100 degrees in the summer, and it can be like 20 degrees below zero in the winter. I don't drive this car in the winter, fortunately, but there are kind of crisp fall mornings where I will drive it, and you want to make sure that it's got to start at lower coolant temperatures. So we may be dialing in from like 70 degrees forward. We'll be able to test starting it when it's hot, but I won't be able to test this area until later on in the year. The best I can do is kind of interpolate it and hope it's got to be linear. But in the fall, I'll circle back to this and I'll do a few tests, especially if it takes longer to start and has to crank over a lot more. So I've given it some time. Let's go up to logging and we'll go to the internal log and I'm just gonna reset it. And it wants me to power cycle it again. So I turn my key off and I can see it disconnected at the bottom. Then I turn my key on and I'm gonna click OK. And I'm gonna close that. And my wideband's still showing 8.5, but I'm gonna give it a start and see what happens. There it goes, it shows 11.5 and I haven't started the car. So here it goes. And it's at 10.9, 11 right now, so it's a little bit better. I probably have a little bit more to go for this temperature range. So let's just repeat that. So I've got the car off, logging, download EC log. I'm just going to tell it to keep because we're going to clear it again. You'll get really good at this after you do it 20 times. I think I'm only going to have to do it probably this last time, and I think it'll be pretty good. And then it's something I'm going to circle back to and spend a lot more time on once I get to actually tuning the rest of the car and boost and everything. So let's open up this. I'll leave my key on so that the sensor stays warm, and just like before, look for the start. And you can see my wideband's kind of reading early, which is good. It's not stuck on 8.5. And this is where I started the car. This green line going down is where it transitions from that start table to the actual fuel map. And then right around here is where it's warming up. And it actually shows 13.4, and then it goes down to 10.3. So as it's warming up, it's still running rich. And where are those values coming from? Well, 13.7% is coming from the start extra table, and then the coolant table, we've got our 16.6%. And our fuel map value is 2.3. And I know the fuel map values are pretty good because when it ran warm, it was idling around 14.7. So it's already up to 11. So let's do one more round of changes here. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to adjust this a little bit more. And this is where if your fuel map values aren't correct, you could really trying to be compensating for it here. And it really needs to be compensated for your fuel tables. Let's drop this one just a little bit too. So I'm going to save this and we're going to do one more test, and I'm going to go logging. I heard that this looping has a bug in it where it doesn't work, but it was also an old firmware version. Maybe it's been fixed. That's why I haven't tried using it. It says it needs to be power cycled. And got the key on. Still shows 8.5. Just letting my wideband, now it says 12.6, so let's try this. So that seemed a lot better. It showed around 10.8, 10.9 on the gauge, and already it's at 11.3, 11.5. So this is much better than it was. And what I'll probably do is I'll live with this for now, and then once I continue tuning, I'll circle back to it. Usually these start tables are one of the last things you do, but if your car is running rich or lean during warm up, you really need to do something about it, because you're not going to want to mess with the throttle or go to your fuel table and increase and decrease the cells to fight with it. And let's take a look at the tuning tab. You can see it's 12.2. So it's still warming up. My coolant temp is 108. I don't have my feedback control on. I will turn it on though. It's not going to do anything till 120 degrees at least. And I'm giving it some more time right now where we can look at the start extra decay, and we'll be able to see that count to 0. So we're right here in this map. If I go to the starting tab, it's the same thing. So it's getting down there. It's not much of a slope. And this should be pretty linear, but it may have to curve a little bit. It all depends. So I'm at 14 air fuel right now. And this shows my start extra. It's hovering right here. And we can also watch it. I think it's on here. If not, I'll add it. So right now it's not giving any start extra, and the start extra ends down to 0. So it's already counted down. And there's this logging channel too, and this just means that the internal logger is turned on. Let me go back to the tuning tab. So my air fuel's looking for 1.7. There still is a little bit of feedback going on. I don't think I had this area of the map 100% dialed in, so I could play with it a little bit more. But when you do change this and you do make these values a little bit smaller, you saw all the calculations here. Once it gets past that crank injector time, it's reading from that fuel map, and all of these calculations, these percentages, are going to come from what's in this table. So anything you change in this lower region is going to affect your starting. So right away, I'm jumping right to the beginning. And here's my initial pulse. We can see the wideband is reading. And my air fuel ratio is coming down. This green line's where it's transitioning from the start table time versus the fuel map time. So it's going from 2.52 to 2.23. And my air fuel ratio is still in the 10s. It does seem to get to 11 quicker. I can see there's still some start extra being applied. What's my coolant temp? My coolant temp is 91 here. So I could probably take a little bit more fuel out. Maybe I'll move all the cells in the table, because it's still 10% being applied everywhere. And take a look at the start extra end. We're at 88 right now, and I said this would count down to 0, and you can kind of see it count down to 0. And it's at 3.9 is being added. It's at 16 for a count, and now we're down to 0. So a few things I'll probably tweak a little bit more. I said that was my last time, but maybe I lied. So I did decrease the fuel cells just a little bit, so it idled a little cleaner. And since those are going down, this initial pulse is also, I'm going to lower it so it falls in line a little bit better. So instead of doing the 2.5, let's do 2.2. And I'll save that. And then over here for this table, the warm-up enrichment doesn't provide any once the coolant gets up to temp, but this table still does for that duration. I'm just gonna decrement the whole table just a little bit. So instead of being 10%, this is 2.8%, and we'll give that a try. So with those changes, I can try starting it again, but I think my coolant temp, I'm at 160 degrees right now. So trying to test these warm-up enrichments isn't going to do a whole lot because it's kind of leveled out in both tables. I'm going to have to let the car cool down before I do it again. But it was probably fine before I made these last little tweaks, and I have a feeling this is going to make it better just from experience. And what I'll do is anytime I go out to tune the car and work on it, I'll spend about 10 minutes on the startup tables just to kind of help with this cold start to get it a little bit better. But for right now, we've got these adjustments made, and the car is kind of warmed up right now, so it's probably the best time to try a warm start. So let's do that right now. Let's go up to logging, and I'm going to go into this startup, and I'm going to say reset it, and okay, wants me to power cycle, and shows disconnected, and it's back on, and I'm going to click OK. I'm just going to let my wideband kind of catch up. So there shouldn't be too much going on right now. This is kind of leveled out where it is going to provide a little bit of fuel, but it's only going to provide it for a shorter amount of time. And we'll see what my air fuel ratio is. My wideband is reading now, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's try starting it. So it fired right up. And I don't know if I can catch it quickly. Yeah, the start extra is already dialed down. I go to my tuning tab. My air fuel ratio is right around 14.7. I do have feedback on, but it's not really doing a whole lot. This is normal. This is actually really good with the 1000cc injectors I have, and it's right here on the fuel map. And if I click follow ECU, you can kind of see it's pulling in values from all of these cells. Go over to the larger fuel map. That's where it came from when the car started. It went down this path, and this is where it's been hovering. So that was a pretty good warm start. I'm happy with that. Let me turn the key off. I'm gonna flip it back on, and I want to just take a look at my log. So I'm gonna download it. Close this window. and we'll save it. It'll be the most recent one. My laptop's a little fussy when it comes to double clicking. So we'll go over here. There's where it started from, and you see my initial pulse is 2.45, so it's no longer 2.52 because I lowered it. This is where it transitions to the fuel map. This is where the load is closer to 0, so it jumps up in the fuel map, but as the vacuum comes in, it dips down, so it comes back down in the fuel map. And this is the start extra, this orangish line here. And you can see it's counting down a lot faster, and less fuel is being applied. So it is at 11.4, and it's at 12. Still at 12. The start extra is about 50% of the way through, and my O2 is at 14.9, and it dips a little bit, or it goes a little bit leaner there, as my start extra is adding less and less fuel. Oops. Start extra is just about done, and now it is finished, and here's my air fuel ratio. There shouldn't be any extra things being added. My fuel map value is 2.21, so if we find that, it's still 2.21 after the AIT. Alt TPS is 2.21 if we go back to this chart. Then next is warm up, and that's at 2.21, so that didn't take anything out. And then it goes to boost. So the boost is actually what's bringing it down to 0.83. That's that boost fuel trim, because that's where it is in vacuum. And that's going to be linear, and that's what we want. So that 0.83, it seems like that sticks all the way through the fuel pulse. So the only thing that modified that was this trim right here. So as it got pulled more into vacuum, and this kind of fluctuates around a little bit, that lowers my fuel pulse, and that's what we'd expect. And this is pretty close to 14.7 air fuel. And I have my feedback on, and that should do a little bit of correction. I don't know if I have that logged here. I probably should if I don't see anything about O2 feedback. We've got O2 number 1. Yeah, I don't have it logged here. But the final pulse was 0.83, and then we added the battery offset, and at a good working battery of 14 volts is around 0.8, so you add 0.8 to that, and that's where you get your pulse of 1.6, so the math adds up, which is good. So this should be fine for start and idling. So that just about wraps up the tuning session. Let me just go back to the start table. One last thing that you may want to do, we've been starting the car, and we're only really worried about this initial part because I haven't had my foot on the gas pedal, and we do have it going lean down here. One thing you may want to do is just grab some of these middle cells and raise them a little bit. That way you can kind of vary the throttle a little bit if you feel like it needs to add a little bit more fuel or a little bit less fuel. You can press on the pedal more. So I'm just going to make a kind of high region here, and this a little bit smoother. Just something where if you do give it a little bit of pedal, if your car still isn't starting 100% perfect, and you know you're gonna mess with it later, this will just give you a little bit more of a window to play with. You have what we initially give. You could give it a little bit more if you need to, and then lean it out. And then lastly, this initial crank pulse, I'm using it. Some people uh, don't use it. You could technically zero it out. If you didn't want all the injectors to fire at the same time when you start, you could turn crank inject all to off, and then they'll fire sequentially. If you still want that kind of first time they fire to give a little bit more fuel, you can keep values in this table. So instead of all the injectors firing at once, giving it that kind of 14.3 pulse we talked about, um, the first time through when the injectors fire, it'll give them 14.3 one at a time. But it's kind of a balancing act. Just see what works best for you. There's no right or wrong answer if the car starts. But definitely circle back to this like I'm probably going to do in the fall. You don't want to be that guy leaving a car meet and you turn the car over and it cranks for 10 seconds and you feather the throttle and it finally starts. You should be able to get your car to start fairly decent with AEM. Some people say that it doesn't start as well as an OEM car, but I don't think that's the case. If you play with these tables long enough, you should get it to where it reliably starts without too much effort.